The locks were changed by Tuesday afternoon, and by then I'd been sleeping over the garage for almost a year, so I want to start with the part nobody believes. I want to start with the fact that I let it happen on purpose. My son thinks I'm soft. He's thought that since he was about 16, since the year his mother got sick, and I suppose I gave him reasons. I'm a big man who cries at the end of ball games. I built houses for 38 years with these hands, and I still can't watch a dog limp across a road without my eyes going wet. He mistook all that for weakness. Most people do. What he didn't know, the night he stood up at his own kitchen table and told me to give my room to his wife or get out of their house, was that the manila folder I keep in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet already had enough in it to take everything they were standing on. He thought he was watching an old man fold. I was just deciding when to lay the cards down. Let me back it up, because if I just tell you the ending, you'll think I'm a hard man, and I'm not. I'm a tired one. I built that house in 1991, the year my daughter was born. 2 stories, 4 bedrooms, a wide front porch. I poured myself on a July weekend that nearly killed me, out in a township east of Columbus, Ohio, where the corn started about a half-mile past our mailbox. My wife, Nora, picked the paint colors, and I framed every wall, and for 30 years, it was the best thing I ever made. Better than any of the developments I put up for other families. When she died, 4 years ago now, cancer, the kind that takes its time so you can watch. I kept the house because keeping the house felt like keeping a little of her. Her hand cream was still in the medicine cabinet. I never threw it out. Some mornings I'd open that cabinet just to smell it, and then I'd close it and go make my coffee. I had 2 kids. My daughter Beth lives outside Seattle with a husband I like, and 2 girls I don't see enough. She calls every Sunday, and my son, who stayed close, in town, which I used to think was the lucky one and turned out to be the curse. My son married late, at 34, to a woman named Camille. I want to be fair about her, because for a long time I tried to be. She was pretty in a careful way, the kind of woman who never has a hair out of place even at a backyard cookout, and she had a soft voice and a habit of touching your arm when she talked to you. The first Thanksgiving she came, she brought a pie she'd made herself, and she sat with me on the porch after dinner and asked me about Nora, asked the right questions. Let me talk. I remember thinking, my son did all right. I remember being grateful that somebody wanted to hear about my wife. I tell you that so you understand I wasn't blind. I was lonely, and a lonely man is the easiest mark there is. There's no folder thick enough to protect you from that. It started, like these things do, with kindness. About a year and a half after Nora passed, my son sat me down. At a diner, I remember, the sunrise off Route 40, 2 coffees and a plate of biscuits between us, and told me he was worried about me rattling around that big house alone. He said Camille was pregnant, first grandchild, and wouldn't it make sense, he said, for them to move in, help with the house, be a family again. He said the word family 3 times in about 2 minutes, and each time he said it, I felt my chest do something it hadn't done since the funeral. I said yes before the biscuits got cold. I'll be honest with you about something the way I wasn't honest with myself at the time. There were small things, right at the start, that I noticed and explained away. The first week they moved in, Camille rearranged the kitchen. Fine, a woman likes her own kitchen, but she boxed up the things of Nora's, the chipped blue mug, the recipe cards in her handwriting, and put them in the garage to keep them safe, she said, and I never saw them set out again. She had a way of mentioning, lightly, always lightly, how a man my age really shouldn't be climbing ladders, driving at night, handling his own banking. You've earned a rest, she'd say, and pat my arm. It felt like being loved. That's the thing about it. It felt exactly like being loved. That's the thing about it. It felt exactly like being loved. By the time the baby came, a boy, Theo, and Lord, I loved that child the second I held him. I had drifted into a smaller and smaller corner of my own life. I'd given up the master bedroom, so the baby could be close to the nursery, which was reasonable. So I moved to the spare room down the hall. Then there was a stretch where Theo was colicky and crying woke me, and I was exhausted. You can see it on him, Camille told my son. So wouldn't it be more comfortable for everyone if I took the apartment over the garage? There was a finished room up there, a place I used to use as an office with its own little stairway. It was cold in the winter and the heat barely reached it, and the window unit did the work in summer, but they framed it as independence. My own door, my own space, privacy, she said. At your age, you want your privacy. I want to answer the question I know you're asking because I asked it myself 1,000 times at 3 in the morning up in that room. There were 4 bedrooms in that house. Why the garage? Why, with all those rooms, did I end up over the cars like a stored couch? The answer is that it didn't happen all at once. It happened the way you gain weight or lose a friendship. A pound, a week at a time. Each step small enough to seem unreasonable to fight. One of the bedrooms became the nursery. One became Camille's office, which she kept locked. One held boxes, and the master was theirs. By the time I understood the shape of it, I was already up over the garage, and going back downstairs would have meant a fight. And I had been raised by a Depression-era father who taught me that a man keeps the peace in his own family even when it costs him. Especially when it costs him. So I kept the peace. And I paid for it. The thing that woke me up, and I mean woke me up the way cold water does, came in an envelope. I still got a little mail at the house, mostly junk. The occasional thing for me. One Saturday in October, a letter came from the bank, and it was addressed to me. And Camille must have missed it in the stack because she was usually the one who got the mail in first. It was a notice. A home equity line of credit had been opened against the house. My house. The deed was in my name and Nora's, and after Nora died, in mine. And there was a line of credit drawn against it for $90,000, and a chunk of that $90,000 had already been spent. I read it standing in the driveway. I read it maybe 6 times. I have built and bought and sold enough property to understand exactly what that piece of paper meant. Somebody had used my house as collateral for $90,000 and I had not signed anything. Now, I'm a contractor. I've signed 1,000 documents in my life and watched plenty of men try to slide something past me at a closing table. My first instinct, my hot instinct, was to walk inside and put that letter on the kitchen table and watch their faces. But I'd learned something in 38 years of business that saved my hide more than once. When you find one cockroach, you don't stomp it. You wait, and you watch, and you find the nest. Because if I walked in there and made my scene, they'd have a story ready, and it'd be my word against theirs. And they had something I'd been short on lately. They had my son's certainty that his old man was getting confused. So I didn't say a word. I put the letter in my truck. And the next Monday, I drove down to the county recorder's office, which I knew well from a lifetime of pulling permits and deeds. And I asked the clerk, a nice woman who remembered my company, to pull everything filed against my property in the last 2 years. I sat in my truck in that parking lot with the papers in my lap, and I felt my hands shaking, and not from age. There was the HELOC, of course. But there was also a deed. A quitclaim deed, dated 8 months earlier, transferring a 50% interest in the house to my son. My signature was on it, notarized, and I had never signed it. I knew I'd never signed it the way I know my own name, because the signature on that deed was a careful, slow imitation of mine, the way somebody copies it from a check, and the real one has a kick on the tail of it that a forger never gets right. I'd staked closings on that kick. I want to tell you what that did to me, sitting in the truck, because the anger came second. What came first was grief, plain grief. Because somewhere in my house was my son's wife sitting at a notary's table forging a dead man's. No. Forging a living man's name. My name. My son's name was on the receiving end of it. And I had to sit there in that lot and reckon with the question of whether my own boy knew. I drove home and I went up over the garage and I did not sleep. Here's where I made the decision people don't believe. I decided not to confront anyone. Not yet. I decided to find out how deep it went, and to do it so quietly that when I finally moved, there'd be nothing to argue about. A man's word is worth nothing in a kitchen at night. But documents and recordings, those holed up in a room with a judge in it. The next morning I called a lawyer, not the fellow who'd done my business for years. He'd retired to Florida. But a woman named Joan Castellano, an estate and elder law attorney downtown that Beth had found for me, of all people. Over the phone the week before. Beth had been after me for months to get my affairs in order, and I'd been brushing her off. And now I was glad I hadn't lost her number. I went into Joan's office with my folder of recorder's documents, and I laid it on her desk, and I watched a woman about my daughter's age read it and go very still. "Did you sign this quitclaim?" she asked. "No, ma'am." "You're certain?" "I'm certain, the way I'm certain I'm sitting in this chair." She set it down. "Then this is forgery, and it's a felony, and the HELOC drawn on a fraudulent interest is fraud, and we have options. But I want to ask you something first. and I want you to think before you answer." She folded her hands. "Do you want to protect yourself and your house, or do you want to put your son in prison?" I'd been so busy being angry, I hadn't let myself stand in front of that question, because the honest answer was that I didn't know if my son had done this or if it had been done to him too, with him too dumb and too in love to see it. And I am ashamed to tell you that even then, even holding the proof, I wanted there to be a version of the story where my boy was just a fool and not a thief. Joan was patient with me. She walked me through it. She said, "We move slowly. We gather. We get you protected. And we let the people who did this show us who they are before we decide what they deserve." She had me put a credit freeze on. She started the process to challenge the deed. And she told me something I held on to. She said, "The cruelest thing about people like this is that they count on your love to keep you quiet. So your love is going to be the thing that buries them, because they won't see it coming." I went home and I kept the peace. God, that was hard. That was the hardest stretch of my life. Harder than the hospital, because in the hospital, I was allowed to grieve out loud. Now I had to sit at the dinner table with the woman who'd forged my name and pass her the green beans and say thank you when she cut my meat for me like I was already gone. I did one more thing, and I'll tell you about it plain because some folks will say it was sneaky, and I suppose it was, and I'd do it again tomorrow. I started recording. Not video. I'm no good with that. I bought a little voice recorder, the kind you can buy for $40, and I kept it in the breast pocket of the flannel I always wore around the house, the one she never thought twice about. Ohio is a one-party consent state for recordings, which I confirmed with Joan before I did a thing, meaning I was allowed to record a conversation I was part of. I was always part of these. I just stopped talking and started listening. For about 6 weeks, I caught nothing but ordinary cruelty. The way she'd talk about me in the next room as if the wall were soundproof and I were deaf. "He's getting worse. He left the stove on again. I hadn't. We just need to get the rest of it transferred before he gets any squirrelier." The rest of it. I sat up over the garage and played that back and made myself a cup of coffee at 2 in the morning and didn't feel a thing except a terrible level calm. Then came the night that gave me everything. It was the second week of November, cold already, and I'd come down to the kitchen for water around 11 because I couldn't sleep. And the house was dark, and I heard her on the phone in the locked office. The door cracked because she thought everyone was down for the night. I stood in the dark hall in my socks like a thief in my own house, the recorder running, and I listened to my daughter-in-law tell whoever was on the other end of that line exactly who she was. She said the old man was almost done. She said she'd married into a paid-off house and a fat 401k and a widower too sad to count his own money, and that her only mistake had been not moving faster. She laughed about the garage. She actually laughed. She said it had been easier than she thought to get me up there, that I was so desperate to be wanted I'd have moved into the shed if she'd asked it sweetly enough. And then she said the thing I'll hear in my head until I die. She said the only loose end was getting the house fully into my son's name so they could sell it out from under me before the daughter in Seattle starts sniffing around the will. And then I heard my son's voice. He'd come down. And he said, quiet, but I heard it, "Just don't move him out till it's all signed. He'll make a scene with his lawyer." And she said, "He doesn't have a lawyer. He doesn't have anybody." I went back up over the garage and I sat on the edge of the bed and I held that recorder in both hands like it was a hot coal. And I understood that my son knew. He knew. That was the night something in me that had been bending finally set, like concrete does. And I stopped being soft. Not bitter. Set. I want to skip ahead, because the next 2 weeks were just logistics, and you don't need the logistics. Joan moved. She filed to void the forged deed and she put the bank on notice about the fraudulent line of credit, and she had a forensic document examiner ready to testify about that little kick on the tail of my signature. She had me get my will, my power of attorney, all of it redone clean and walked down, naming Beth as my agent. Because I'll be honest, I didn't trust myself to hold a pen near my son for a while, and she made a call I didn't fully appreciate at the time to a contact at the county prosecutor's office, because forgery against an elderly person in our state is the kind of thing they take an interest in. I kept passing the green beans the whole time, the blow-up. The part you'd put on a thumbnail came at dinner, and it came because they forced it. They didn't know what I had. They thought they were ahead. Tamil had decided I learned later that it was time for the last push, and the push was to get me out of the house entirely so they could list it. So one night at dinner, with the baby in the high chair and a roast on the table, she made a good roast, I'll give her that. That's the awful intimacy of it. My son set down his fork and told me they'd been talking, and that with the baby getting bigger, they really needed the garage apartment for an au pair, and that he'd found me a real nice senior apartment across town, and that it'd be best for everybody if I was out by the end of the month. I asked, calm as I could, where exactly that put me, and that's when he stood up. My boy, the one I taught to ride a bike on the very driveway outside that window, stood up at the table and his voice cracked the way it used to when he was a teenager losing an argument, and he shouted at me to either take the apartment they picked or get out of his house that night because he was done carrying me. His house. He said his house. In the house I built. At the table I built. In front of the grandson I'd have given my arm for. The room went quiet. The baby started to fuss. Camille had her hand to her mouth, performing shock at her own husband's outburst, already building the story where I was the unstable old man who'd been asked nicely. And I want you to know, I felt the old urge to soften it, to keep the peace, to say, all right, son, don't upset yourself. 40 years of that habit standing up in my throat. Instead, I wiped my mouth and I set my napkin down and I said, all right, I'll go tonight. You should have seen the relief on their faces. They thought they'd won. They thought the old man had folded one last time. I went up over the garage and I packed a single bag. Nora's recipe cards from the garage box went in first, before any of my own clothes, and I drove that night to a motel out by the highway. And I lay on a stiff bed listening to the ice machine, and I felt, more than anything, free. The waiting was over. They'd made their move on the record in front of everything, and they'd done it themselves. The next morning I called Joan, and I said, it's time. Now here's the part I take no pleasure in, and I want to say that plainly because I've replayed this story to enough people whoop and holler at this point, and it isn't a whooping kind of thing. It's a funeral. Joan moved fast because everything was already built. Within 2 weeks, the forged quit claim was formally challenged with the document examiner's report attached, and it didn't survive 10 minutes of scrutiny, a forgery never does, against a man whose real signature is on 40 years of public records. The bank, faced with proof the lien rested on a fraudulent transfer, started unwinding the HELOC and turned its attention, hard, to who had drawn the $90,000. And the recording. The one where my daughter-in-law laughed about the garage and named her plan and my own son told her to keep me quiet, went to the prosecutor. She was charged. Forgery, identity fraud, and a financial exploitation count that the state added because I was over 65. They take that seriously here, and they should. My son wasn't charged in the end, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't have a hand in that. Because when the prosecutor asked me what I wanted, I sat in that office a long time and I thought about Nora, who would have walked through fire before she'd see her boy in a cell. And I told him I wouldn't push it on him if he cooperated. He cooperated. He gave them everything on her to save himself, which told me more about my son than any forged deed ever could, and broke what was left of my heart on a whole separate shelf. The marriage came apart inside of a month. There's no spending money you have to give back. She moved out and then she moved on, the way that kind does, already 3 towns over, looking for the next sad man with a paid-off house. And I hope to God somebody's grandfather sees her coming. And the house. My house. It was always mine. The forgery being void meant the deed never moved an inch off my name, and the eviction they'd threatened me with turned around backwards. My son had no legal claim to a single brick of it. I let him stay through Christmas. I did that for Theo, and for the ghost of the boy he used to be. And then I told him quietly, no shouting, that he had until spring to find work and a place of his own, and that I would not be paying for either. He's a grown man. He'd spent 2 years being kept by a thief and calling it being married, and the most useful thing I could do for him, the only fatherly thing left, was to make him stand up on his own legs and feel the floor. He hated me for it. He'll hate me for a while. That's all right. Love that won't ever say no to you isn't love. It's just a long way of getting somebody hurt. I did sell the house in the end. Not because they took it from me. Because I wanted to. I walked through every room I'd framed, and I said goodbye to it the way you say goodbye to a person. And I sold it for more than I ever dreamed it'd bring in this market. And I took that money and I did the one thing Nora and I always talked about doing and never got around to. There's a lake up in northern Michigan where we honeymooned in 1985, And there was a little cabin on the water there we used to drive past and dream about. I bought a place on that lake, not the same cabin. That one was long gone, but close, with a dock and a window over the sink where I can watch the water turn silver in the morning. I put Nora's recipe cards in a frame on the kitchen wall. I set out her blue mug. Beth comes with the girls in the summer now, and they swim off the dock and shriek at the cold water, and I sit on the porch. I didn't have to pour myself this time, and I let an old man's eyes go wet watching them, the way they do. My son and I talk, a little. He calls about once a month, and we keep it to the weather and to Theo, who I see when I can, who I will always make room for, because none of this was that baby's doing. It isn't what it was. It'll never be what it was. But last time my son called, he was quiet for a minute, and then he said, "Dad, I'm sorry," and didn't try to explain it or wrap it in anything, just said it, and I told him I knew, and that was the truth. People ask me, when I tell this, if I regret letting it go on as long as I did, if I should have made my stand at that first kitchen table the night they moved me up over the garage, and I tell them no. Because a stand made in anger is just a fight, and you can lose a fight. What I did instead was let them write the whole thing down in their own hand, in their own voice, and hand it to me. The folder in the bottom drawer didn't fill itself. They filled it. I just had to be patient enough, and yes, soft enough, to let them. I'm 71 years old. I built houses for a living, and the first thing they teach you is that you can't see the rot from the outside. You have to open the wall. It costs you something to open it, but a man who won't open the wall because he's afraid of what's behind it ends up living in a house that falls on him while he's asleep. I sleep just fine now on the lake, with the window open. The water does most of the talking, and every so often when it's very quiet, I think about that table I built and the boy I taught to ride a bike on that driveway, and I let myself be sad about it the way you're sad about anybody who's gone. Then I get up, and I make my coffee in the blue mug, and I go stand on the dock and watch the morning come up over the water that my wife and I dreamed about for 40 years before I finally came home. The folder in the bottom drawer didn't fill itself. Camille filled it, line by line, in a voice she thought no one was listening to, and that is the thing I keep coming back to on the dock in the mornings. People who hurt you are almost always counting on something, and what she counted on was that a sad old man would keep being soft until there was nothing left to take. She read me right about the softness. She read me wrong about everything that came after it. I've thought a lot about why it ended the way it did, and it wasn't luck. A forged deed gets undone because forgery is a crime, and a crime is a seed you plant against your own future. She drew the line of credit. She laughed about the garage. She said the part out loud about the daughter in Seattle, and every one of those was a choice that came due. My son chose to stand up at that table and call my house his, and that choice cost him a marriage and the easy life he'd been living on a thief's arm. None of it fell out of the sky. We were all just collecting on what we'd put in. What saved me wasn't anger. Anger would have had me flipping that table the first night they moved me up over the garage, and I'd have lost. Because a man shouting in his own kitchen is just a man shouting. What saved me was the willingness to keep my hands clean while I waited, to refuse to forge, to refuse to lie, to do the slow, lawful thing even when the fast, cruel thing was right there. And it was the patience to watch instead of strike, to learn the shape of the rot before I opened the wall, the way you measure twice on a beam that's going to hold a roof up. And underneath all of it was the plain stubbornness to get up every cold morning over that garage, past the green beans, and not break, because the day you break is the day they win. If I could hand my grandson Theo one thing across all the years between us, it wouldn't be the lake house or the money. It would be those three together. Be the kind of man who won't sign the lie even when it would be easy. Be the kind who looks before he leaps and learns before he moves. And be the kind who can stand in the cold a while longer than the people betting on him to quit. Nora used to say a person's true size shows up only when life tries to make them small. They tried to make me small. They handed me, in the trying, the proof of exactly how small they were.